somebody who passed away who we just referenced, and I want to be a little more specific, and that's Dr. Gwen Hankerson. And I think this is very important for us to use, not only to mourn her passing, but to celebrate her life. Gwen was somebody I knew for about 40 years. Now, I'm old, but I'm not that old. And she was symptomatic and illustrative of a different generation. She wrote a great book, which I'm very proud to say I was the second purchaser of that book, loosely named Across the Tracks, or The Other Side of the Tracks, in which she spoke about, in doing it with the book in conjunction with some church elders, talked about the history of Broward County, and specifically the racial history of Broward County. So I think it's especially important in this month, Black History Month, to talk about a little bit about the book and more about Dr. Hankerson. And I, of course, knew her before she was Dr. Hankerson. And she talked in the book about the other side of the tracks and how Broward was in the 40s, the 50s, and the 30s, and into the 60s, about what it was to live in Broward County, Florida, and not be white. And she spoke about the type of community that existed on the other side of the tracks, and the harmony that existed there, and how it thrived, and how people did well, and people left their doors open, and people looked out for each other. These were actual sentences from her book. And talked about the sense of community. And then looked at things afterwards. She also talked about how in that community, like in many other communities where they were black or white, about that community made a diligent effort to be looking out for each other's families, each other's kids. In effect, to be our brother's keeper. And how that worked in that community on the other side of the tracks. Those who know Gwen know she was tough. For those of you who know her, I can tell you, for those who don't, she was very tough. And she did not suffer fools lightly. You could tell by a look about her unhappiness or her disregard for what was being said. She was so tough that I have to say, it's almost ironic, but it probably is not, it's on purpose, that if she was going to pass away, she waited for February for Black History Month. She waited. She was stubborn enough to be able to do that. And it was interesting because it reminds me of some other folks. It reminds me how we just very recently, a few years ago, had the celebration, the 50th anniversary of the celebration of the desegregation of Fort Lauderdale Beach, which was 1961. And in fact, when they did an article on the 50th anniversary, in the Sun Sentinel article, they quoted Dr. Hankerson, who at the time, back then, was a swim teacher at the then segregated Dillard High School in 1961. And the quote from the article was, well, we always thought the beach belonged to God, and everybody else had the right to use it. That was in the 50th anniversary article. But I think we have to invoke a few other people. I think we also have to invoke a lady named Eula Johnson, who I also knew until her death around 2001. And she was then the president of the NAACP. And the desegregation, or the wade-in, was begun by her and then others. Another gentleman who was involved was a guy named Charles McLyman. Now, what's interesting about all three of these people, they were all members of the Broward DEC. All of them. And that's how I got to know them. And way back when I started in 1974 on the DEC, obviously I was like 5 years old, obviously. What used to happen, and what's important to remember, is that then the DEC was much smaller, much smaller. And it was just the beginnings of a Democratic county. It was just breaking out of the embryonic stage. And what we used to do, because we used to meet downtown in the old county commission chambers, which was pretty small. A few heads are nodding and remember. And then we'd go out for coffee at Lester's on State Road 84, because not much was open, I can assure you. And I, as then a college student, used to sit around and hear stories. And hear stories from Eula Johnson and others. And whether it was Eula Johnson or Mr. McLyman, or even Dr. Hankerson just a little bit later, they all had a common thread. I was a history major in college, so I found this very interesting, and they would talk about the history of Fort Lauderdale, and the inequities, and the unfairness, and a lot of stories that were very, very telling about police departments and so forth. And they would talk about the desegregation of Fort Lauderdale Beach, and they talk about other fights, and lunch counters, and all those different things. But what was remarkable was, they never said during all these sessions I sat there having a cup of coffee, not one of them ever said what their role in it was. They would talk about it, how it happened. But not once did they ever say, and I organized it, or I marched in it. They never included themselves in that history, in that fabric. Never. None of them. There's an obvious lesson to be learned from that. And so it was also with Dr. Hankerson. And may I add, and so it was with a lady who's no longer with us, Frankie Thomas, who was our vice chair. And I'm still very close to the family because they were like family to me and still are. And she would talk about living in West Palm Beach and being very young and school ending because they had to go out to the bean fields. And school stopped until those fields were cleared for months. It's a very different existence than many of us know. Very different. And that's why Dr. Hankerson wrote the book. She didn't make it to make money. She wasn't going to make any real money from that. That's for sure. But the history she wrote, and all these people were all people who preceded most of us on the Broward Democratic Committee. And Dr. Hankerson stands for, as do the rest, that we cannot be only about winning elections. That's important. And God knows the governor's race is more important than anything we've experienced recently. But we also have to stand for what's right and for what issues are right. Because if we don't stand for something, we stand for nothing. And then we're like the other party. The party that offers no solutions, just attacks, but offers no alternative. That's really the legacy of Dr. Hankerson and those who came before her. To talk about a greater good, to fight for something that's worthy, for standing up, not when it's easy, but when it's tough. That's what makes us Democrats. That's what made them the way they were. They stood up for what they believed, irrespective of what the consequences might be. And that's why when we go out and we try to tell folks how to vote, that's important. But before that happens, we have to have some credibility for ourselves as an organization, and as individuals, and as human beings. And the way to do that is to honor the legacy of all those people that came before us, even from this body. And by standing on their shoulders and on their principles, we then stand for something. And I think perhaps that is the greatest way in this particular night to honor Black History Month and to honor Dr. Gwen Hankerson. Truly, truly one of us. Thank you.